One, two, three. We are recording. Moving on with looking at the history of evolutionary thought. And by now, you've all watched, or you should have, this documentary from 1985 on the growth of evolutionary biology that does about as well as you can in an hour and looks at the connections between Darwin's thought and wider areas of importance. And I told you to ask some questions, and we'll answer your questions on the air in the next 5 to 10 minutes or so. Somebody asked, did Linnaeus create experiments with the plants he was observing similar to Mendel, or did he just make detailed observations? Linnaeus originally thought that every species of animal and plant existed as it had been created back in the 6,000-ish years prior in the Garden of Eden. He speculated that the Garden of Eden must actually have been a giant mountain because that was the only way that one garden could contain Arctic plants and tropical plants in the same area. It must have been really steep. Towards the end of his life, I don't think he did controlled breeding experiments. I guess he might have. I do know that he did observe cases of hybridization. You can get related species of plants sometimes to hybridize with each other and create a third form that isn't like either one of the parents. We'll actually see some spectacular examples of that about midway through the course. But a lot of our common fruits and veg, for example, are hybrids. Bananas don't have seeds because they are triploid hybrids between two different species. And by the end of his life, Mendel was willing to accept that new species could come into existence by hybridization from previously existing species. That's the closest I think he got to doing anything like what Mendel did. He did observe some crossing between different species and varieties, and was softening on his stance that every species was separately created. Maybe God just made a limited number of species and later ones appeared by crossing among that initial batch. He was pretty right about that, but we'll talk more about hybridization and speciation later. Somebody asked, did Buffon not consider fossil records and their implications because the discovery and validity was not well known at the time? Remember that when Buffon is working, there's still a lot of big discoveries that just haven't been made yet. For example, it would still be decades before a guy named Richard Owen would describe this new taxon called the Dinosauria. There'd been big bones dug up, ever since the days of the ancient Greeks. A writer named Adrien Mayor has argued that legends of things like Cyclops and Griffins and things like that are based on discoveries of fossil bones that were interpreted as being monsters. But there's still an enormous amount of legwork that had to be done, just finding fossils, studying them, publishing them, working out what order of appearance they had through time. And a lot of that just hadn't been done in Buffon's time. One thing they didn't tell you about was that Buffon believed that species in the Americas, the New World, would end up just being kind of degenerate versions of species in the Old World in Europe. And he actually carried on a debate with one of the best scientists in the United States at the time, who sent him some fossil bones and some skeletons of living North American mammals to show him that our American mammals were just as good as European mammals any day. That great scientist was Thomas Jefferson, third president, writer of the Declaration of Independence, and yes, slave owner as well, but definitely one of the brightest people in the fledgling United States. And he actually got into a scientific debate with Buffon. Um, so, yeah, I think Buffon considered them, but there was still a lot that just hadn't been done on the fossil record at the time. Okay, was there any opposition from the scientific community against the gross misinterpretations of Darwin's ideas? The example I can think of off the bat came in 1950 in the aftermath of World War II and, of course, the rise and collapse of the Nazi regime and the first beginnings of the United States to try to deal with its own racial problem. There was an international committee of biologists convened by this newly formed group called the United Nations, specifically by UNESCO, the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. And they polled some of the best folks in the world and released a statement to the effect that racism was basically scientifically wrong, that humans did vary, but our genetic variation is much less than our genetic similarity, and there was no scientific evidence for inborn racial inferiority, that differences in intelligence and things like that had everything to do with culture, nothing to do with your genes. Mind you, there were a couple of disgruntled geneticists that set up some counter organizations, including one called the Patriot Fund, that, well, never mind that. They put out some pretty crap quasi-scientific journals and things like that. But yeah, there's always been opposition against misinterpretations of Darwin's ideas. The famous example I can think of is the UNESCO statement of 1950, but there's more. Essays by a gent named Stephen Jay Gould are actually really good on this. He was a very respected evolutionary biologist who also wrote essays about the social implications of evolutionary biology. They're in some collected books of essays that I can recommend. He would be a good source of further reading if you want to learn more about that. Okay, how does one bone determine the entire skeletal structure of an animal? I'm curious as to how scientists can be so sure their predictions could be correct. Okay, well, the answer is that we're not. The answer is that any reconstruction of an extinct animal is a hypothesis, and it's always subject to further testing as we find more bones. The documentary showed you Cuvier's, what he called the law of the correlation of parts, which just means that organisms are integrated. Every body part reflects a certain lifestyle. And so if all you have is one body part, you can logically work out what the rest must be like. So, for example, animals that eat a lot of tough plant material like grass tend to have very tall, broad, grinding teeth, and they also tend to have big bellies for a big intestine that can ferment all that cellulose. So if you find one big grinding tooth, it is reasonable that the animal must also have had a big belly like a cow, let's say, for a big herbivore gut, big barrel-shaped body. But that's not the end of it. You would test that by hoping to find more bones. And you would change your reconstruction as more evidence comes in. And people do this sort of thing all the time. I mean, the example I can think of is when I was a kid, dinosaurs were still thought of as being basically very large lizards. And if you follow up on recent findings on dinosaurs, we're finding that a lot of them were feathered and were a lot more active than, the big ugly iguana type things that I grew up with in the early 70s. That happens all the time. Um, you know, Reconstructions of extinct animals are hypotheses, and you go out and test them. And that's what we do. Okay, why did so many different groups of people choose to pick certain parts of Darwin's ideas to listen to? One of the things is that anytime you've got a really big idea or set of ideas, people tend to take different parts and run with them. I'm actually thinking about US history. During the Civil War, you had some ministers preaching the gospel, reading right from the Bible, and arguing that God hated slavery. And you had preachers in the South who were reading the same Bible, sometimes in the same denominations, citing various proof texts to show that God was perfectly okay with slavery and it was natural. And, there was nothing wrong with it. So, same book, same denomination, two radically different interpretations. And, I don't think Darwin's work is a religion, but, the same text can inspire some people in very different ways from what other people take out of it. And that documentary didn't even show all of the things that people have taken. There was Darwin inspired a Russian guy named Pyotr Kropotkin, one of the founding fathers of the modern anarchist movement. I've got a book buried somewhere in my office that uses Darwin to argue for animal rights. Um, People take, out of something that far reaching, people tend to take all kind of bits and pieces and glom them onto what they're already sure is true. It's a natural tendency. Um, Hitler and company took certain things out of Darwin's writing out of context, and lots of other people have as well. And this is why we make you take your core classes on things like philosophy, because we're trying to immunize you against being too quick to do that sort of thing. But I mean, if it's happened to the Bible, it's happened to Darwin, it's happened to Karl Marx. Um, People tend to run with ideas in very different directions. Could Darwin ideas be interpreted in a way depicting democracy? Sure. What came to mind is a guy named Richard Dawkins came up with the idea that not only do bodies over time evolve, but ideas do in the same way. People come up with ideas, everything from jokes to religions, try to spread them, and some get passed on from mind to mind and some don't. And there's a kind of natural selection process going on, not acting on genes, but acting on what he called memes. Now, you now know a meme as a funny picture on your Facebook feed, but as it was coined, it basically meant any unit of information that spreads and can take off or not take off. And you could certainly argue that you get the best development of ideas if memes are allowed to flourish in a democratic environment with maximum possible freedom of speech in the press. A guy named Karl Popper, in his book, The Open Society, presented some similar ideas, and that would be a good one to read. Okay, I may be able to take a few more later on this week, but let's get to The Origin of Species, which was published in 1859. And I showed you this slide before. The public's reaction was rather strong, as people realized that if evolution by natural selection applied to all life, it applied to humanity as well. And this raises the uncomfortable question, that the apes in the zoo might actually be our cousins. So here you have a gorilla asking the uncomfortable question, am I a man and a brother? The point of that, I'm recapping here. We talked about this at the end of Thursday, and this might give you some comfort if you were bothered about the way that Darwin's ideas got incorporated into, both Nazi and communist ideologies. Darwin's own family had been very outspoken activists against slavery. Um, Remember that Britain itself had not had slavery since the Middle Ages, but when Darwin was a boy, um, actually when he was a young man, I think it wasn't until 1835-ish, maybe 34, that they finally abolished it in the British Empire. When he was a young man, it was still going on in places like Jamaica, which was a British colony at the time. It was basically a big sugar plantation. And Darwin saw slavery firsthand when the Beagle visited Brazil. And in fact, it was one of the few things that Darwin and Fitzroy ever fought about. Fitzroy was very conservative. They visited a plantation and we're talking about slavery, and the plantation owner called in all of his slaves and asked them how they liked being slaves. And they basically said, oh, it's great, it's wonderful. We didn't like that stupid old freedom anyway. We're well treated, everything is terrific. And Fitzroy said, there, you see, it's not so bad. And Darwin said, look, the owner was right there with them. Did you really think they were going to start complaining? And Fitzroy said, are you calling me a liar? And they had a tiff for a couple of days. And then they finally just kind of agreed not to talk about it. But yeah, Darwin wrote, these deeds are done and palliated, excused by men who profess to love their neighbors as themselves, who believe in God and pray that his will be done on earth. It makes one's blood boil, yet heart tremble to think that we Englishmen and our American descendants, with their boastful cry of liberty, have been and are so guilty. I have to tell you this before the legislature makes me stop. Darwin's grandfather, Josiah Wedgwood, is famous for his ceramics. He made fine, tableware, china, and things like that in a big factory using scientific principles. Wedgwood china is still very highly esteemed if you're into fine china. Maybe not all of you are, but people that are know Wedgwood very well. And he'd also created the early 1800s equivalent of one of those Livestrong bracelets. This is a ceramic medallion. It's showing a chained slave on one knee. And I don't know if you can read the words going around the top. It says, am I not a man and a brother? That's almost the same slogan as you see in this cartoon right here. And that's the point of the joke. Darwin's raising the very uncomfortable possibility that, not only Africans, but gorillas might actually be related to us Englishmen and perhaps deserve the same rights. Eek! How totally horrifying. And things really heated up when he got around to publishing his views on human evolution. He said virtually nothing about humanity in The Origin of Species, but in a book called The Descent of Man in 1871, he summed up what could be known about human ancestry. Now, most of the fossils that we now have were not known at the time, but he did talk about what there was and concluded that our closest relatives are, in fact, the African great apes, chimps and gorillas. And then in a book called The Expression of the Emotions, which is what's being caricatured here, he argued that there's no unbridgeable gap between human minds and animal minds. that the feelings that we have, our tender sentiments of, love and devotion and all of that, have equivalents, maybe a little simpler, but direct equivalents in non-human animals, that our minds are not so different from the minds of chimps, monkeys, and dogs, that there's a gap that could not be crossed by evolution. Descended from apes? My dear, let us hope it is not true. But if it is, let us pray that it will not become generally known. That's supposedly a genuine quote, although no one can seem to track down exactly who said it, and its authenticity may well have been questioned. We're not sure if it was actually spoken by the wife of author Coventry Patmore, who you're looking at right here. And today, Darwin is sometimes attacked for being a racist or even the inspiration for Hitler. Now, as we have seen, the people that influenced Hitler did borrow some ideas from Darwin's writing. Ernst Haeckel, in particular, who was so enthusiastic about Darwin, he was called Darwin's apostle to Germany. And Glenn Beck made this point, and I listened to his whole radio show so that you didn't have to. And he says Charles Darwin is the father of modern day racism. This guy is a horrible racist, the father of the Holocaust. I've had to field questions from people who point out with the air of a smug gotcha that the full title of Darwin's book is On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Existence. You go, preservation of favored races. What does that sound like? I, of course, point out that that's what's on the title page, but if they'd read the actual book, you know that Darwin uses the word race to refer to breeds of dog and varieties of cabbage. Race was just the standard word at the time for any kind of variety. It did not necessarily mean human races, and in fact, the origin of species says nothing about human races at all. I think when we teach history, it's often done to try to give people heroes. When I was in grade school in the 70s, Columbus was a hero. We had to sing in assembly. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. He sailed and sailed and sailed and sailed and found this land for me and you. Yeah, we really did sing that. The brave explorer who crossed the ocean and discovered a new world where everybody could live in peace and harmony after killing off the natives and enslaving the Africans. But anyway, this, of course, has changed a great deal, and now Columbus is being seen as a villain. And a lot of the controversies we've had about what gets taught in schools, about the 1619 Project and our legislature's attempt to ban it, about statues to Columbus and statues of Confederate soldiers and things like that, are about history as a way of finding the right heroes or villains to cheer for and boo. The truth is that most people are really neither one or the other. And when I talk about historical figures, I'm not trying to give you either heroes to cheer or villains to boo. Most people are kind of a mix of, people are the same wherever you go. There is good and bad in everyone. And Darwin was not a saint. Darwin was a wealthy Englishman who lived in a very nice house, at a time when people were starving, at a time when the British Empire was at its greatest extent and not always doing very nice things to the people that it was ruling. And Darwin wrote some things in some of his books that sound very prejudiced. This is a quote from The Descent of Man, where he's discussing the chief causes of the low morality of savages, the confinement of sympathy to the same tribe, insufficient powers of reasoning, and thirdly, weak power of self-command. The reason why people like the Fuegians are not very moral is they're not smart enough, they're not used to self-discipline, and they're only nice to their own people and really mean to everybody else because they haven't learned any better. Poor things. You can probably convict him on sexism charges more than racism, but he did say some pretty nasty stuff by modern standards. But he wasn't a modern person. He was writing in the late 1800s. And you have to set that against the fact that Darwin made a powerful argument that there aren't any unbridgeable differences between human races and societies, that fundamentally, in the ways that matter, we're the same. And this is why I brought up John Edmonstone in the first day. Here he writes, the American Aborigines, Negros, and Europeans differ as much from each other in mind as any three races that can be named. Yet I was incessantly struck while living with the Fuegians on board the Beagle with the many little traits of character showing how similar their minds were to ours. And so it was with a full-blooded Negro, John Edmonstone, the taxidermist, with whom I happened once to be intimate. It just means very friendly. So there, sure, we have outward differences, but the mind is fundamentally similar. You know, people of completely different races, ethnic groups, cultures, and backgrounds can laugh at each other's jokes, can recognize that they all have minds of a similar kind, with the same kinds of emotional responses and a lot of the same, well, really all of the same intellectual capacities. Seen in that light, Darwin is making a pretty damn woke argument for racial equality. You know, the idea that we've all got savage people in our ancestry, we've all got apes in our ancestry. There's no reason anybody needs to be too proud. And that our fundamental nature is ultimately the same. When you compare that with some ideas that were coming out of early scientists in the United States, like a couple of scientists named Josiah Nott and another guy named Samuel Glidden, who were arguing based on skull measurements that the races of humanity were actually separate species, and thus enslaving Africans was not different from domesticating cows because they were fundamentally unlike us white people. Compared to that, Darwin looks pretty damn good. And I hope that gives some degree of comfort to the people who were a little spooked by, you know, Hitler and the communists getting drawn into the conversation in that documentary that that we watched. Someone asked how Darwin would have reacted to things like the rise of Nazism. I think he would have been utterly freaking horrified. And I think this is why. I think he recognized that the differences that divide us have a lot to do with culture and damn little to do with biology. So that's my take on it, and I hope it soothes a few people who might be uneasy here. And as he put it at the end of Descent of Man, we must acknowledge that man, with all his noble qualities, with sympathy which feels for the most debased, with benevolence which extends not only to other men, but to the humblest living creature, with his godlike intellect, oh, hey, that's me, which has penetrated into the movements and constitution of the solar system. With all these exalted powers, man still bears in his bodily frame the indelible stamp of his lowly origin. You and me, baby, we ain't nothing but mammal. Okay, never mind. Now, these ideas did get pretty vigorously debated in the scientific community. Um, there was a lot of debate among people who didn't go off and support the commies, the Nazis, or the capitalists. A lot of books that were written arguing with Darwin's ideas and coming up with alternatives and things like that. Darwin himself, remember that he suffers from chronic illness at this time. He can't really get out and go to scientific meetings and present his ideas publicly. Fortunately, he had a circle of friends who he'd been keeping in the loop as he was developing his ideas. And Thomas Henry Huxley, shown here, who, by the way, had also sailed on a Royal Navy voyage around the world to the tropics. He'd been ship's doctor on board Her Majesty's ship Rattlesnake, which had explored Australia. So he'd seen a lot of the same things that Darwin did. Huxley read Darwin's book and thought to himself, how stupid of me not to have thought of that, and wrote his friend, as to the curs which will bark and yelp, you must recollect that some of your friends at any rate are endowed with an amount of combativeness. I am sharpening up my claws and beak in readiness. Huxley was such a Darwin promoter that he became known as Darwin's bulldog. But he was not a mindless fanboy. He was still, for a long time, skeptical of natural selection. He admitted it was the best idea anybody had going, but it still needed work and it still needed evidence. As he wrote in 1860, it was an extremely valuable and in the highest degree probable doctrine, indeed the only extant hypothesis which is worth anything in a scientific point of view, but still a hypothesis and not yet the theory of species. There were holes and gaps in the idea, and I'll show you some of those by the end of lecture. Several people asked about religious reactions. Those were all over the map. Very few people at this time, there were a couple, but very few people with any scientific background still held on to a strict literal interpretation of the Bible, where the earth was created on October 26, 4004 BC at 9 o'clock in the morning. And yes, somebody tried to calculate that for reasons. Most people who'd given any study of the matter were willing to accept that the earth was a lot older than 6,000 odd years, and that life had come in to be the way it was by some kind of natural process that could be, in principle, studied. So, and I say that because all too often people think of this as being, this black and white struggle between either the Bible is absolutely true in every word and the earth is 6,000 years old, or you accept Darwin and then you're on the highway to hell, you evil atheist, Obamacare loving Democrat voting libtard. Very often it gets presented as this very black and white thing. I've participated in debates with people who have this very black and white mindset that either you're all the way here or you're all the way there. The relationship between evolution and religion has always been a lot more interesting than that. And this is Darwin's old geology professor, Adam Sedgwick, who was horrified with what his pupil had done. As he said, I have read your book with more pain than pleasure. Parts of it I admired greatly, parts I laughed at till my sides were almost sore, other parts I read with absolute sorrow. There is a moral or metaphysical part of nature as well as a physical. A man who denies this is deep in the mire of folly. So the idea is that, Darwin is neglecting the spiritual side of things in his ideas, and Sedgwick just simply couldn't have that. He was horrified at what his pupil had done. That being said, Sedgwick still did a great deal of the work in working out the order of appearance of fossils, especially the very old ones at the base of the British fossil record. And Darwin had noted back when he was a student that Sedgwick had no difficulty at all with the idea that the Earth was indefinitely old. He wrote to a friend, "What a capital hand is Sedgwick for drawing large checks upon the bank of time." Check being like the way people used to get money back in the old days. They'd write it on a piece of paper and take it to the bank. You might have heard of those back before everybody did everything on cards. So yes, Sedgwick was perfectly fine with the idea that the Earth was an awful lot older than the strict interpretation of the Bible would say. There weren't that many people that kept waving the natural theology banner, but there were some. Louis Agassiz had grown up in Switzerland. By the time this comes out, he's a professor at Harvard, and he's one of the few people who opposed all ideas of evolutionary thought for a significant length of time after Darwin's work came out. And he's still waving the banner of natural theology as proposed by people like William Paley, writing that all these facts and their natural connection proclaim aloud the one God whom man may know, adore, and love, and natural history must in good time become the analysis of the thoughts of the creator of the universe. So that's what Linnaeus was after, if you remember. And Paley, understand life and you'll get inside God's head to the extent that any human being can, and understand what he had in mind. You'll be like Isaac Newton, who supposedly came up with the laws of gravity and said, "Oh God, I think thy thoughts after thee," meaning now I understand what you were thinking. But there were others that were a lot more nuanced. Darwin's only real American friend was another Harvard professor, a botanist named Asa Gray. Gray's botany is still used as a textbook, although it's been edited and updated quite a bit since the 1850s. But yeah, if you take a botany class, you may well come across his work. And he was a very devout Presbyterian, I think, and he accepted evolution, but always believed that God was ultimately in control of the process, that God was using biological evolution to accomplish his ultimate purpose. In this, he agrees with my mother. As Gray wrote, "One who believes in the existence of a creator, the fountain and source of all things in heaven above and the earth beneath, will see in natural selection the struggle for life and natural selection only the order or mode in which this creator in his own perfect wisdom sees fit to act. Happy is he who can thus see and adore." Oh, yeah. Underneath all of this struggle for existence thing, God is working to accomplish his purpose, and studying evolution should, increase, not decrease, your appreciation for God. So that's a point of view now called theistic evolution. Theism is the idea that God not only exists, but she is active, working in the world. And theistic evolution is the idea that God can work through the processes of evolution to get done whatever God needs to get done. This is the position of the Roman Catholic Church and most mainline Protestant denominations, by the way. I'm not going to tell you what you should think of it, but this is a pretty widely held position. And it's what my mom told me when I started asking awkward questions about the Bible and Archaeopteryx back when I was 2. And actually, when I was about 8. Not really when I was 2. I will take you on one trip to the darker side, yet another cautionary tale. Darwin's cousin, Francis Galton, was actually one of the founding fathers of modern statistics. The guy wanted to analyze everything numerically, even come up with a statistical way of measuring the beauty of women to find out what part of the United Kingdom had the prettiest girls. According to him, the prettiest ones were in London and the ugliest ones were in Scotland. Having been to Scotland, I think he was talking out of his butt, but anyway, that's neither here nor there. Galton thought that if this evolution thing was true, humans ought to apply artificial selection to themselves to improve the species. And he called this idea eugenics. Humans ought to selectively breed themselves to become better, smarter, stronger, faster, all of that. He wrote a book, Hereditary Genius, in which he argued that intelligence and character were all essentially inborn and genetic, and that environment didn't have much to do with it. As he said, I have no patience with the hypothesis that babies are born pretty much alike, and the sole agencies in creating differences between boy and man are steady application and moral effort. This went over really well in the United States in the early 20th century. Early 20th century, the United States is beginning to freak out about letting in all these immigrants because we have people flooding to this country with strange customs and weird religions and strange food, like, people from and bizarre religions like Roman Catholicism and Judaism. This is when a lot of Italians and Poles and European Jews and Irish are flooding in. Asians are beginning to immigrate over on the Western side. And people are starting to freak out about it, and they're starting to worry that if we allow too many people of inferior stock to come into this country, they'll outbreed us and drag the country down. So eugenics went over big as scientific support for this idea that immigrants are ew gross. Any similarity between policy 100 years ago and now is entirely intentional. There were groups like Fitter Families for Future Firesides that spread the word. That's an exhibit at, I think that might be the Texas State Fair back in the early 1900s. They even sponsored eugenics contests. Just as you can enter your cows or your tomatoes or your strawberry jam in contests at the county fair, you could enter yourself and enter your family and get a blue ribbon in like the small, medium, and large family categories. A group called the Eugenics Record Office carried out research on eugenics largely by taking human pedigree charts and also put out propaganda in favor of eugenics. Here this picture says that eugenics is the self-direction of human evolution. Like a tree, it draws its material from many sources and organizes them into a harmonious entity. And the roots are labeled genetics, biology, anthropology, statistics, biography, sociology, religion, medicine, and so on. This is how popular this was. One of the first movie blockbusters was a movie called The Black Stork, which dramatized a real life case of a doctor that had refused to save the life of a baby born with birth defects because the doctor believed in eugenics. There was a sensational court case. The doctor was declared not guilty, and the resulting publicity drummed up support for eugenics. So here, this poster saying things like, "Save the nation from itself. See the black stork. When you have seen the black stork, you will force the passage of a national eugenics law. The black stork is a plea for humanity to act. Do not allow the nation to decay. See the black stork. For the sake of your children, see the black stork." The Eugenics Record Office also lobbied for laws that would keep the unfit from breeding. They weren't just trying to promote people of superior stock breeding. They tried to discourage inferiors from breeding. In 1907, Indiana passed the first law in the US that mandated that people deemed feeble-minded by the state had to be surgically sterilized. If the state decided that you were, of subnormal intelligence, you would get your tubes tied, whether you wanted them tied or not. 30 states eventually passed such laws. They were a lot easier to enforce back in the day when people with mental deficits or mental illness tended to get packed off to institutions. Back when, people are kept in, huge state mental hospitals out in the middle of nowhere. I think Arkansas State Mental Hospital, I think it used to be in Dardanelle, which is pretty much nowhere, if you've ever been there. It's a lot easier for things like this to be done. Some of the patients in there did have, mental retardation or things like that. In other cases, they were perfectly normal kids that maybe mom remarries and stepdad doesn't want any stepkids underfoot, so he gets them committed. That used to happen. They were seen as enlightened and progressive at the time. We could improve the country and really make a better life for our good people if we just stopped the bad people from breeding using the latest techniques of science. There was actually a Supreme Court case, Buck versus Bell, that established that such laws were constitutional. The Supreme Court justice that wrote the decision, Oliver Wendell Holmes, said something along the lines of, I can't quote it exactly, but it was, if the state can demand, able-bodied people sacrifice their lives by being drafted into the military and risking death, then it has the right to demand that other people sacrifice for the good of the state. If some people can get drafted and risk being killed, then the state has the right to make other people sacrifice in the same way. And as he wrote, 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. There's a lot of problems with this, and I think I might try to unpack these I know what I'm going to do. We'll actually look at this a little bit more. These laws didn't start getting repealed until the 1960s, I think. Arkansas technically still has its law on the books, or it did a couple of years ago when I checked last, although I don't think it's enforced anymore. But the law has never been officially repealed, or at least it hadn't as of, I guess, 5 years ago or so. There were people like, Native American women used to go to the hospital for something completely unrelated and find that their tubes got snipped into the 1970s and later. A problem with eugenics is the fact that it is so hard to enforce in any way that is remotely fair. Um, and in many cases, it was not, and it was enforced in very blatantly unfair ways. There's also some scientific reasons why it doesn't work, and maybe we can talk about those in a little bit. But once again, this is why you can't be blind to the fact that scientific ideas do tend to make it into the public policy sphere and sometimes get used in pretty damn horrific ways. I mean, seeing the interaction of science and politics has been, we're in the middle of the coronavirus pandemic. You've seen Trump, arguing with Fauci. We've all had a ringside seat to this sort of thing. This is why you need to be aware of how it works. Okay. Soon after Origin of Species was published, more evidence accumulated that supported some kind of biological evolution. This included Archaeopteryx, which turned up in 1862. It's not the only one. There are 7, I think, known Archaeopteryx fossils. The rock deposit is not rich in fossils, but it's been quarried ever since the days of the ancient Romans, because it splits into very large flat sheets that make very good tiles. It's also, well, never mind. So anyway, it's not very rich in fossils, but so much of it has been dug up that we have an impressive collection now. And Archaeopteryx had teeth, had a long bony tail, had claws on its hands, looks like a small dinosaur. And in fact, one of the 7 skeletons was collected, thought to be a small dinosaur, put away for 20 years. And then somebody opened the museum drawer and said, hey, look, this tiny dinosaur's got feathers on its wings. Somebody asked, this is certainly not the only fossil that we have that blends features from what we now classify as 2 different major groups. That's something I want to get into later in the course, but there are certainly more fossils like this than just Archie. Lots more. But again, there'll be a time when I can bring that up a little more gracefully. There's also the discovery right as Darwin's publishing, 1858, 1859, of stone tools like this, clearly made by humans. Now, those had been found, ever since ancient times, just like in parts of Arkansas, you can find, old native arrowheads. If you look, people had been finding stone tools for, hundreds of years, probably more. These were the first discoveries in which tools were found directly associated with the bones of extinct animal species. This was the first evidence that humans had been around at the time that woolly mammoths had been around, and that in fact they had hunted them and butchered them and left cut marks on the bones where they'd cut off the meat to roast it or whatever they did. That suggests humanity is a lot older than anyone had suspected, that humans had actually been around when extinct animals had been. How old, no one was prepared to say yet. That comes later, but dang, we've got a much longer history than anybody thought. And there's even the discovery in Gibraltar and then in 1856 in the valley of the Neander River. The German for Neander River Valley, by the way, is Neanderthal, a word you might have heard, of bones that look human-like, but not entirely. This is one of the first Neanderthal skulls to be found. Looks a little odd because this, I think it is a man, lost all of the teeth on the left side of his jaw. And when you lose teeth, I mean, unless, your dentist comes in and does something to fix it, you not only lose the teeth, but your body absorbs all the bone that used to make that socket. So if it looks like there's that weird gap on the left side of his mouth, that's because this was a fairly old man when he died. All of the teeth on the left side were missing, and all of the socket bone, all of the tooth alveoli, uh, were reabsorbed by the body, maybe years before death. Aside from that, this looks very human, except the brows are huge, the midface sticks out, there's no chin, the skull vault, the crown of the head is much longer than modern humans and much lower than modern humans. And there's consistent differences between skeletons like this and skeletons of modern people. Could this be human ancestors? Well, Neanderthals, it's more complicated now that we know a lot more. And it wouldn't be until the 1920s before we began finding a greater diversity of human ancestors and relatives, mostly in Eastern and Southern Africa. But this is the first glimpse that people are getting of the possibility that there used to be relatives of ours that were not fully paid up members of Homo sapiens. Interesting. So by about 1870, pretty much everybody, with the exception of people like Louis Agassiz and this very pious British marine biologist named Philip Henry Goss, almost everybody else was down with the idea that evolution had happened. It had proceeded through some kind of natural process that the scientific method could study objectively, and it had happened over an extremely long period of time. Maybe God had something to do with it. Maybe that wasn't science's job to worry about. But one way or another, some kind of natural evolution is taking place. But natural selection was not widely accepted in Darwin's lifetime, not for about another 50 to 60 years. At best, natural selection was seen as one mechanism of evolution among several. There were people that revived Lamarck's ideas. There were people that come up with the idea that evolution happens on a kind of predetermined trajectory, that descendants will tend to get maybe larger than their ancestors, not because of the environment, but because of some internal drive. Or evolution happens, but God periodically intervenes and speeds it up or something like that. There were lots of alternatives going on. Thomas Henry Huxley's grandson, Julian, called this period the eclipse of Darwinism. So why? Why did nobody buy natural selection as the prime mover of evolutionary change? One argument was the Earth couldn't be old enough for natural selection to produce everything from the goo to the zoo to you, as they say. Everything from pond scum all the way to the president. You can't, natural selection doesn't have enough time to turn slime into Taylor Swift or whatever the pinnacle of evolution might be. The argument was made that there was no way selection could work because interbreeding would wash out population variation. I'll talk about that in more detail in a little bit. There's also the problem Darwin has no explanation for where variation comes from or how it gets passed on, although to be fair, nobody else knew either. But you have to remember that Mendel is still breeding his peas in the Abbey of St. Thomas in what's now Brno in the Czech Republic. He publishes his work in 1865, but it mostly got ignored for 35 years. So Mendel is this obscure monk who's published his work in a journal that almost nobody reads. And it wouldn't be until about 1900 before some people hit upon Mendel's work after he was long dead and said, holy cow, I think I understand now. So all of these arguments are going on with no really good understanding of how genetics works. There's also the fact that natural selection's not a predictive law. Now, you could take Isaac Newton's laws of gravitation and motion, do quite a lot of math, and you can predict where the planets are going to be decades or centuries into the future, and you'll be right. Those laws have predictive value. You can predict the trajectory of everything from a planet in its orbit to a cannonball shot out of a cannon. Natural selection doesn't have that kind of predictive value. It's historical science. It happens not as the result of, a small number of forces acting in accordance with understood laws, but with a whole bunch of things, one thing after another. How it works is very dependent on, local environments and conditions. Somebody asked a question about the astronomer John Herschel. I'm not sure why, but Herschel was not really a big fan of Darwin's, and he was the one who said that evolution by natural selection amounted to the law of higgledy-piggledy. Higgledy-piggledy, of course, meaning everything in disorder. My grandmother would have said iggly-woggly. Right. So I don't know why someone brought up Herschel, but, I think you were reading my mind. Herschel was not really a fan. Guy by the name of Fleeming Jenkin, poor guy, Scottish engineer and economist, helped develop things like underwater telegraph cables, the internet of the 1880s. Jenkins pointed out what he felt was a serious flaw. Okay, Darwin says, in a population, individuals vary. Where that comes from, nobody knows, but it's true. Individuals vary, and sometimes a variant will just happen to be well adapted to the environment that it's in. Maybe it's a little faster. What the heck, let's do this with giraffes. Maybe we have a population of short-necked giraffes, and from somewhere we have what used to be called a sport of nature and would now be called a mutation. We get a giraffe with a longer neck. And let's say that our longer neck giraffe grows up to be very healthy because he's got lots of food, because he can eat leaves that the short neck giraffes can't. Okay, all very well and good. So our long neck giraffe grows up and he starts having thoughts about girls, and he goes through giraffe puberty and decides he wants to make giraffe babies. Who does he have to mate with? He's long-necked, but all of the girls, all of the female giraffes are going to be short-necked. So he finds a nice short-necked giraffe, and they have babies. And let's say that those babies have kind of medium necks. Okay, they're shorter than dad's neck, but maybe that's still useful. But unless the medium necks start marrying each other, like, they're up in, Marshall, Arkansas. Sorry if anybody's from there. Sorry about your sheriff. If the medium necks don't marry each other, they're only going to have short-necked giraffes to marry as well. And then they'll have babies that are kind of medium short, and unless they marry their cousins, they're going to marry short necks. And the point is that long neck trait is going to get shorter and shorter as it spreads into the population, kind of like putting a drop of red paint in a bucket of white and letting them mix, that red just gets lost until it has no effect at all. So any variation that happens to be favorable, the favorable ones still have to mate with individuals that don't have that trait. And so that trait is going to get diluted generation after generation. So selection can't work because it's got nothing to work on. There's no way of preserving those favorable traits. Another Scot, William Thomson, Lord Kelvin, much more formidable opponent. This is the Kelvin who more or less founded thermodynamic physics, got a temperature scale named after him, one of the best scientists and engineers of ever, decided that he had physics, he had math, he had numbers, and he could disprove the doctrine that transmutation has taken place through descent with modification by natural selection. Aye. It went like this. We know the Earth has internal heat. You can tell by volcanoes. If you go in deep mines, it starts getting hot. The deepest gold mine on the planet is in southern Africa. I forget how far down it goes. It's a couple of thousand feet, and the rocks at that depth are 150 Fahrenheit, and they have to have a monster air conditioning system or the miners would die. So it gets hotter as you dig down. The increase in temperature averages about 25 degrees Celsius per kilometer. That's about 1 degree Fahrenheit every 70 feet. So the Earth is hot on the inside. Anything that's hot in cold space radiates that heat away through what we call black body radiation, and that rate is governed by the laws of physics. So if we know the Earth has internal heat and it's losing it at a rate that we can calculate, then fairly recently it must have been so hot it was molten. We know how hot the Earth is. We know or can estimate how fast it cools down. Put those together, run the numbers, and the Earth must have been molten too recently for Darwinian evolution, which Darwin thought of as this ploddingly slow process. Darwinian evolution can't have had significant effect because there hasn't been time. Kelvin's ballpark estimate of the age of the Earth was more than 20 million years, but not more than 400 million years. He kind of leaned toward the younger end. So the Earth can't be much older than 20 million years old. And that includes all the time that the Earth didn't have life. Life must have somehow come into existence and evolved everything from bacteria to Kim Kardashian in less than 20 million years. And it didn't seem possible that evolution could do all of that in what doesn't seem like a very large amount of time. You can't draw checks upon the bank of time indefinitely. They'll start bouncing. Huxley claimed that Kelvin had done the math right, but he must have missed something. This quote basically says, "Garbage in, garbage out. As the grandest mill in the world will not extract wheat flour from peas, pages of formulae will not get a definite result out of loose data." Still, Kelvin's words carried a lot of weight. Lamarckian evolution was back in favor for a long time because Lamarckian evolution can happen faster. You're not sitting around waiting for favorable variations to come up. Variations appear because organisms make them appear in Lamarck's ideas. There were other scientists that accepted evolution but invoked something else to explain major changes. Russell Wallace, the co-discoverer of natural selection, got into spiritualism late in his life, the belief that souls exist after death, and you can talk to them. So he got into mediums and seances and table rapping and things like that, and argued that evolution could not explain the appearance of the human soul. Huxley argued that change wasn't always gradual, it could be very rapid, a theory called saltation. And he used to argue this with Darwin. Remember, he's not a mindless fanboy, but debates Darwin even as he's promoting his ideas. Darwin himself never ruled out Lamarckian evolution, and in later editions of The Origin of Species, in 1872, this is the last edition that he published in his lifetime, he accepted a greater role for Lamarckian evolution. As he put it, something may be attributed to the definite action of the conditions of life. He means the environment directly acting on phenotype. Some effect may be attributed to the increased use or disuse of parts. That's Lamarck. The final result is thus rendered infinitely complex. And that's a pretty good place to stop. I'll end with, yeah, but, and on Thursday, I'll answer the yeah, but part. And we will actually get off the history quite so much and start getting on to modern science. We'll start looking at evolution and how it relates to genetics. But I will stop recording now.